Over this past weekend, Wizards of the Coast held MagicCon Chicago, basically a big Magic convention where people play and or talk about card games a lot. It's officially held by Wizards, so there's definitely some stuff being talked about that's relevant to upcoming cards, and we will get to that. But to start with, I want to talk about one of the specific events going on that shapes a lot of what I have to say here. That, of course, would be the Pro Tour, the first one of the 2025 Pro Play season, and a big indicator after Aetherdrift's release of what the metagame for Standard, in this case, actually looks like going forward, which can do a lot to inform how what gets revealed of that set is going to affect that format. So I kind of want to examine the Pro Tour's results. So the metagame broke down with about half of the field consisting of about 3 decks. As per Pixies, none of which made the top 8, Gruul Mice, which technically had 3 decks in top 8 if you count the other 2 red aggressive decks with a very similar engine, and Domain Overlords, a deck that outright made up a further 3 of the top 8, without even having to stretch the definition of that deck. Some people would say that 3 decks making up the majority of the metagame is a sign of an unhealthy metagame, but I don't really think that's the case if the 3 are checking each other, and the others in the further minority also have some ability to check top decks. In theory, that's what should have been happening. The Gruul Mice decks are actually supposed to have a good matchup against Domain Overlords, because they're supposed to come in underneath the long-term game plan of Overlords and just end the game before those decks can really get going. But that doesn't seem like what's happening here when looking at the ranking. Let's even look at what happens in the top 8 here. If we look at all decks that only had 1 loss, there isn't a single additional aggro deck in those top 14. And once you look at the top 26, which adds all the decks that had 2 losses, you see 3 more Mice decks, 4 if you count Temur Ardors, which you very much shouldn't because it's not even close to the same engine. But by that point, you have 4 more straight-up Domain Overlord decks. And don't get me wrong, there are other factors to these placements, including the fact the Pro Tour has 6 rounds of draft as well that affects who gets into the top 8. But I'm only looking at the win-loss records of the standard decks themselves here. And in fact, if we do that, we have to take away the Leyline deck from all this, since in the rounds of Swiss, it actually had 3 losses. So there's even less aggro presence at the top. When we look at what happened at the top 8, this doesn't feel like a fluke either. The guy who got to the top 8 with the 3-loss deck, yeah, not so surprising that he lost, but all of the other aggressive decks were taken out fairly cleanly by Domain, where the top 4 wound up being 1 Gruul Mice list and 3 Domain Overlords, with the final also being a Domain Overlords mirror, including a deck that was undefeated in Standard. Including in the final where they won, by the way. I'm sure there are plenty of people who like the deck, but I can't look at a result like this and not think of the Nadu Winged Wisdom decks from Modern Horizons 3. This isn't as obviously broken as Nadu because of a specific card, don't get me wrong, but when comparing the results, there's definitely a correlation between the two, especially when you consider that Domain Overlords was only a step or 2 below Nadu in terms of overall performance, but 5 percentage points lower in representation in the metagame going in. So it actually does track that there would be slightly lower dominance percentage based on that alone. And for those of you not picking up on this, yeah, I am advocating for something in this deck to get banned. But before the followers of our supreme Domain Overlords start at me in the comments, I actually don't want to kill the deck, because I think that's bad for the metagame too, which is part of the reason I wouldn't call out Up the Beanstalk as the card to be banned, in spite of being in damn near every busted deck in multiple different formats for the past couple of years, since the deck really needs a value engine to function properly, and I'd rather hit something a little more specific to the way this particular variant gets past aggro in particular, which is why I think Zur Eternal Schemer is the card that should see a standard ban. It was very rare in the feature matches that I saw a game lost with a resolved Zur, especially against the Mice deck, with the latter part being chiefly because of that lifelink that it gives to enchantment creatures and its ability to make other games end coming down to that hexproof. Hell, Xur's probably the main reason that Gruul struggles. If it doesn't kill before Xur comes down, with an activation or two of the second ability on it, there's no way for enough aggression to come through to swing the game back into aggro's favor. The basic idea is that you play these enchantment creatures called Overlords, that you can have be on the field but delay being able to use them as a creature, then use Xur to get around that restriction and be able to use them as creatures anyway. It's a control deck with a combo finish, and my idea to balance the deck is to peel out the combo part and make them rely on the control more. Which is where I start talking about Tarkir Dragonstorm, the next set coming in April for MTG, and it's going to be standard legal. Now, those of you not already in the know about what was revealed are probably wondering how in the fuck this could possibly be connected. Hell, I think some of you in the know might be confused as to how I'm connecting these concepts. Well, it's actually pretty simple. One of the overall aspects of the set that's been revealed is that it's going to be a set that focuses on 3-color combination. The original set that took place on this plane, Khans of Tarkir, also focused on this idea, which resulted in the set having a lot of color fixing. And that allowed for the standard format to support 4-color decks very easily, thus meaning one of the theoretical weaknesses of Domain Overlords, its mana base, is likely about to be shored up in this set. Hell, during the original Tarkir block, one of the 4-color decks that was dominating the format was Abzan Blue, which happens to be the exact color combination that this version of Domain uses. So there's precedence for this group of colors doing big things in a Tarkir-related format. Although we didn't get a full-on preview of anything related to the mana-based pieces in Tarkir, what we did get was a card that I honestly think could replace Xur in these lists, and perhaps shift them into a 3-color direction. Skirmish Rhino. It's a 3-mana 3/4 with trample that drains the whole board for 2 when it enters. It's actually a smaller version of a card called Siege Rhino, which has an extra power and toughness and drains for an extra life. This occupies the same place on the curve as Xur, makes a decent bit of recovery and stabilization against aggro board, without just making the aggro matchup impossible once it comes down. And like I said, it shifts the deck into a 3-color direction, since the only blue card in Domain Overlords, well, at the very least the main deck, is in fact Xur himself. And if the fixing gets good enough, you have options to do more blue cards for better control, or go red to get aggressive with it, so it could vary these Overlords engines. Now, I kind of want to go back into my comparison to the original Tarkir block to the current format, because I am noticing some distinct similarities, one of which is probably going to be a hard pill to swallow for Gruul Mice players here. Regardless of whether you think the Domain Overlords deck needs a nerf or not, what the dominance of that deck in that strong of a fashion indicates, at least to me, is what I was saying about Aether Drift in general. We are dealing with a generally slow format. And to be honest, I don't think there's anything wrong with that, because the speed at which a format runs should come naturally to what the gameplay is telling it the speed should be. And neither slow games nor fast games are inherently better than one another as long as the action to support them is there. The Khans of Tarkir Standard. That was also a fairly slow metagame, but had lots of interactions where there was a lot to do at that slower pace. It's part of the reason that it ended up birthing the Pioneer format. And based on the spoilers we have so far, I don't think Tarkir Dragonstorm is looking to buck the trend, if perhaps be maybe slightly faster than old Tarkir. We saw exactly 2 cards that were below 3 mana in the 11 cards that we saw at this time, including 2 commander cards that wouldn't even be relevant to the standard metagame anyway. And I'm actually going to be talking about all of these cards. We're going to start with those 2 that we get the baseline for why I think the speed of the game established in Domain Overlords isn't really going anywhere. Let's start with what seems to be the spotlight card of the set for some reason, based on the fact that they have a picture of the serialized version of it, Mox Jasper. Okay, well, it's obvious why it's got Mox in the name. It's a 0-cost artifact that lets you add mana of any color if you control a dragon. So in reality, for a spotlight card, it's a little bit underwhelming. It's not nearly as exciting text-wise as Aether Spark from Aether Drift. The other low-cost card that's also relevant to Dragon, Sarkhan Dragon Ascendant. 2 mana 2/2 that makes a treasure when it enters when it beholds a dragon, which means you either reveal one in your hand or you pick one on the field. And then when a dragon enters, he gets a counter and becomes a dragon for the turn. Now, first of all, let me talk about Behold for a moment. This is actually a mechanic that was in the original Tarkir block on some cards, but didn't really have a name, and I think it could be used as a cost for some effects more often. So giving it a keyword makes sense in my eyes, although I doubt we're going to be holding anything other than dragons in the set. No, that wasn't a typo. I did that for the wordplay. So before I talk about how the fact that the creature type we're focusing on supporting is dragons is in and of itself an indication of a slow metagame, let's talk about the ways that these cards otherwise indicate slower speeds. So for one, typically there's a lot of ramp in a format. It means that the format is slow enough where early turns get used building up resources rather than developing the board, because you either need to hurt your opponent quickly or avoid getting hurt too quickly. Mox Jasper in particular can't even be used as a resource until your board has some development on it, even, so it's literally something you run out only when it's time to pop off. Sarkon, on the other hand, serves the temporary ramp to get you over the top to cast something big earlier than most would be able to, that an aggressive deck is trying to survive in a slow format would probably greatly appreciate. And he's also a card that gets better as your board develops more as well, since he gets bigger later in the game. But let's double back to the fact that we're dealing with dragons here. So, for those who don't know, probably those who don't really play Magic, dragons are a creature type that tend to be expensive. And while Wizards said that there are going to be cheap dragons in the set, we even have at least one 3-cost dragon in Standard right now. If you're going to focus a lot of the set on them, you kind of need some of them to be below 4 mana anyway. And they've done this before, but with the cheaper dragons normally being setup plays for larger draconic threats, or not even be something that would make sense in a dragon deck to begin with. The 3 color combinations in the set are also going to be led by spirit dragons, it seems, 3 of which were revealed already. Betor, Ancestor's Voice for Absyn, Shiko, Paragon of the Way for Jeskai, and Tival, the Balanced Scale for Sultai. Before I go over what each of these do, I want to note that I found it a little strange that 2 of these are seemingly just revealed for the Commander set instead of the main set, while Shiko has the main set symbol. It's making me wonder in some ways if this cycle is all going to be in the main set, or if we're going to have different versions between the Commander decks and the main set for some of these dragons. But we'll talk about that more when we get there. Let's talk about the cards themselves. Tival is a 4-mana 4/4, and the other 2 are 5 mana, for Betor's 3/5 body and Shiko's 4/5 one. This is what I meant when I talked about dragons being expensive, because this is about average for the way that dragons tend to be costed, with dragons that cost 4 actually being considered kind of on the lean end of things. And all these are actually cheaper than the Dragonlords printed in Dragons of Tarkir, which bottomed out at 6 cost. But those cards were 2 colors instead of 3. So it's really about the same opportunity cost in order to get them out. Let's get back to what's on these cards though. All of them have flying, but now we can talk about what the cards have individually. Betor has lifelink, which is relevant to the other part of the ability, because at your end step, you get +1/+1 counters on another creature based on your life gain, and you get to reanimate something from your graveyard based on your life loss. And that effect makes it clear exactly why this was exciting for Commander especially, because I don't think we've had a life gain commander that actually rewards you for paying that life. This has a very exciting push-pull with what you want to do with that effect, and I don't think even the people who complain about commanders being an engine in and of themselves can really complain here, because this engine is still making you make a lot of decisions on what's important to you in terms of what you do with it. Kind of like Xavier Sol in some ways. Shiko has vigilance in addition to its flying, and is admittedly a little bit less exciting as a commander because it kind of just does a thing when it enters. Namely, exiling a cheap spell from your graveyard and copying it. There's an aspect I think we're going with for Jeskai in this set that this points towards that I'll get to later, but playing free spells tends to be really good. Although I can definitely see why it's less exciting for Commander, because something in blue and white that likes to be blanked, kind of been done once or twice before. More than once or twice, spoiler warning. Tival, on the other hand, doesn't have a second keyword, but mills 3 cards, then lets you play a land from your grave when you attack, and also nets you a 2/2 when cards leave your graveyard. So should be doing it every time it attacks. This is actually very interesting, in part because of color identity and some of the ways that second effect can be used in a way that's not entirely what's intended. We've seen decks that care about lands in graveyard before, but the commanders I think of with that strategy are like Lord Windgrace and Yuma. So while green is a color I'm thinking of with that, and black's a color I at least partially think of with that kind of deck, blue never really comes up for self-milling land strategies. So this is a big shift. This also doesn't have to be used in particular with lands either, and could be used for other things that want cards to leave your graveyard. And I don't just mean Reanimator here. Flashback? Sure. Aftermath? You got it. Jumpstart? Kind of weird to do that without red, but alright. Hell, even putting things in the graveyard back into the deck counts, so you can have some recovery from milling out no matter what you decide to go with. Now, granted, a Sultai deck that plays out of its graveyard is nothing unusual at all. But when you handle it in a way where it doesn't necessarily mean Reanimator, that is slightly more intriguing than average. But I need to go back to Shiko for a moment, because I feel like there's something this and some other cards point to for the Jeskai color combination, red, white, and blue, haha, America colors, in this format. And it points to the expectation for even aggro decks to slow down. See, there's a mechanic called Storm, which lets you copy a spell for each spell cast before it in the turn. In some ways, it's actually one of the most busted things around, to the point where a rating from 0 to 10 of mechanics likely to be printed in Standard was made by Mark Rosewater, which is referred to as the Storm Scale, named after the mechanic that has been an eternal 10, basically meaning that it would take a miracle for that to happen. So you may want to call the bookies, because we have a miracle apparently. Storm Scale Scion, a 6-mana 4/4 that gives other dragons +1/+1 and has Storm. This thing is expensive enough to be decently prohibitive in being able to pull off a Storm kill with rituals, especially since Standard doesn't really have a lot of those, but at the same time is an absolute killer if it can Storm off for even 3 or 4. This is definitely not something you're going to see if Thunder Junction isn't in Standard, since Plot lets you spend mana early in order to cast a bunch of spells at once later, but then again, maybe you will still see it. I mean, sure, it could be nice and innocent, funny little tongue-in-cheek reference that doesn't really do all that much. But then I look at Narset Jeskai Waymaster, and it gets me thinking. Let me explain why. Narset is a 3-mana 3/4 that gives you the option to discard your hand at the beginning of the end step in order to draw a card for each spell you cast in the turn. So, wait. The Spirit Dragon actually lets you cast 2 spells for the price of 1. We had a literal Storm card and another legendary creature that's all 3 colors that cares about the number of cards cast in a turn. I mean, maybe this is just me, but this is an indication that Storm, to some degree, is going to be a theme that Jeskai uses in this set. Storm has almost always been a combo deck with an aggressive finishing style. It's an aggro deck with a combo finish rather than a control deck with a combo finish. And I can't help but wonder if that's the sort of direction that this format is going to take aggro. Take things a little slower, and spend the first few turns setting up those big blows that you intend to do later. One of the interesting things about the spoilers we've gotten is related to Stormscale Scion, and that's the meta jokes and references within the set that actually receive good explanation in the story as well. And it's part of what people actually thought was good about Modern Horizons 3, at least when they were willing to call it something other than the death of magic. Anyway, Stormscale Scion and Skirmisher Rhino aren't the only examples of this that we've seen. I've got a couple more for you. First, I want to talk about Barren Steppe Siege, which is a 4-mana for an enchantment where you choose between Abzan and Mardu as it enters. If you choose Abzan, all your creatures get counters at the end step, and if you choose Mardu, all your opponents sacrifice a creature on the end step if one of your creatures died. The obvious part of the reference is that both Abzan and Mardu have the colors white and black them, with Abzan adding green and Mardu adding red. And I believe it was outright stated that this will be a cycle, so we'll get probably 4 more of these for the other color combination with the clans of Tarkir. But that's not where the references stop. See, these are also references to the siege enchantments from Fate Reforged, where Sarkhan went back in time to save Ugin. Look, it's not important. What is the fact that those had you choose between Khans and dragons when they entered, much like this has you choose between two clans. This was something that was already a big flavor win in the first place, and adding it with the current clan war type of storyline going on uses the rhyming of ideas and mechanics alongside the ways that the story holds parallels in different points in time. One that's perhaps a little bit less on the nose, or more if you look at the flavor text really, but I still love, is Smile at Death, a 5-mana enchantment that lets you revive 2 creatures with power 2 or less and put a counter on them. This is a reference to the card from the original Tarkir, Alesha Who Smiles at Death, who could pay 2 mana when attacking to revive a creature with power 2 or less, tapped and attacking. Notably, Alesha's ability required either white or black mana specifically for those pips, and 2 of the enchantments cost are white, so there's a pretty good direct parallel there. Part of me really wants us to go further as well and have a mirrored version of this card that lets you revive something with 2 black symbols in its cost called Laugh at Fate, as a reference to the new Foundations versions of Alesha that got printed last year. But I'm not holding my breath for something like that. I can dream, but I'm not expecting it. Dreaming like I do of one day making it to the Pro Tour. Sadly, I'm not exactly wealthy, so having the card pool access to really get the kind of rank you need to perform that well is a bit outside of my capabilities. But luckily, this next card will help me accept my inevitable defeat. You try coming up with this many transitions. It's a 4-mana instant that exiles a non-land permanent and drains its controller for 3 life. Notably, this is 3 colors, which seems about right for a 4-mana exile effect in standard with no downside whatsoever. Hey, notably, this can get rid of Zur, and one of the decks from the original Khans that battled against Abzan Blue was Dark Jeskai, which this card happens to fit in perfectly. So, who knows? Maybe we're just headed for a repeat of 2015? Khans was 10 years ago? Fuck, I feel old. Anyway, how old do you feel? What do you think about all the cards that I've been able to talk about today? Want to complain about this video being longer than your average Domain Overlords mirror? Let me know in the comments and be sure to leave a like on your way out. But until next time, this is the FN Boonslayer signing out.